Why the world is silent while Congo bleeds. Are they not human? A cry the world should recognize, but too often ignores. For more than a quarter century, the Democratic Republic of Congo (DRC) has been ground zero for one of the deadliest, most neglected humanitarian catastrophes since World War II. Entire provinces have been turned into killing fields by an unending cast of armed groups, foreign proxy forces, and complicit state actors. Women are raped as a tactic of war. Children are conscripted, mutilated, and killed. Markets, churches, and hospitals are attacked. Millions have been driven from their homes. And yet the international response has been a litany of delayed statements, inadequate peacekeeping, underfunded aid, and political triangulation, while Congo's people continue to die by the tens of thousands. This is not hyperbole. This is a fact. And the largest moral failure of our age is not that Congo suffers, it is that the world has learned to look away. The numbers that should shame every government. When we ask whether Congo is experiencing genocide, or whether we should call it mass murder, facts matter. But the raw numbers alone are already devastating. In 2008, humanitarian studies estimated that roughly 5.4 million people had died between 1998 and 2007 because of the conflict's direct violence and the indirect toll of disease, malnutrition, and lack of health care, a figure that dwarfs most modern conflicts and makes the DRC one of the deadliest crises of the 21st century. The killing did not stop then. In 2025 alone, the UN and Congolese authorities reported waves of mass killings during offensive campaigns. For example, fighting around Goma and the advance of the M23 have been linked to thousands of deaths and the displacement of hundreds of thousands. In one wave early in 2025, national and UN figures placed casualties and displacements in the thousands and hundreds of thousands, respectively. Sexual violence skyrockets in conflict-affected provinces. Humanitarian organizations and UN agencies continue to report surges in rape, sexual exploitation, and gender-based violence as war tactics and as a consequence of displacement and lawlessness. Those facts, 5 million, then thousands more, should have provoked a global emergency response. Instead, the international stage has mostly responded with press releases, half-measures, and competing geostrategic interests. Not a conflict, a pattern of systematic atrocities. Labeling matters. There is a distinction between armed conflict and patterned atrocities that meet the threshold of crimes against humanity or even genocide. The DRC's eastern provinces have seen repeated patterns that should alarm every human rights lawyer, prosecutor, and government. Recurrent mass massacres of civilians by armed groups, including the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, M23, and various militia coalitions in Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu, attacks on churches, markets, and displacement camps, and evidence of targeted summary executions. Widespread and systematic use of sexual violence as a tactic of terror, with medical and NGO reports documenting massive spikes in rapes, sometimes gang rapes and sexual mutilation, and an explosion of survivors seeking treatment. A recurring pattern of forced displacement, with millions internally displaced across multiple provinces, creating chronic humanitarian emergencies and making civilians vulnerable to further abuses. These are not isolated battlefield tragedies. They form a consistent blueprint: terrorize the population, seize territory and resources, fracture communities along ethnic lines, and profit from chaos. When a pattern persists for decades, with predictability and scale, the moral and legal obligations of other states, to prevent, to punish, to assist, are triggered. Yet those obligations have been met with tokenism. The machete, the gun, and the market, the economic engine of violence. Why does this violence persist?
Because it pays.
The Eastern Congo is a vast subterranean supermarket of minerals, coltan, tin, tungsten, tantalum, gold, and more, that power the global tech and industrial supply chains. Armed actors profit from extortion, illegal mining, smuggling, and the sale of minerals to national and international markets. Control the minefields, control the cash. Control the cash, control the militias. But profits alone are not the only fuel. The conflict is sustained by proxy interventions and regional geopolitics. Neighboring states have repeatedly been accused of supporting or turning a blind eye to armed groups that further their strategic aims inside the DRC. Accusations and evidence of cross-border support, for instance, allegations about Rwanda's links to M23, have been central to the cycle of violence. State weakness and corruption. Central authority is weak in large swathes of the country. National forces are often underpaid, under-equipped, sometimes complicit in abuses, and frequently unable to protect civilians. Climate and survival dynamics. Competition over land, water, and resources in the context of a warming climate has aggravated local tensions, producing more explosive dynamics when armed actors exploit local grievances. When violence and profit are linked, the result is a self-sustaining industry of death, and the international market, often unknowingly, continues to be part of that supply chain. Rape as a weapon, the gendered face of Congo's conflict. Ask survivors what they fear most, and many will say, rape. The facts are harrowing and must be stated plainly. Health workers and human rights organizations repeatedly report that sexual violence in eastern DRC occurs with impunity and at catastrophic rates, often used deliberately to terrorize communities and destroy family structures. Reports produced as recently as 2024 and 2025 document surges in assault cases and an overwhelmed system of medical and psychosocial care. Survivors describe gang rape, sexual mutilation, and the use of sexual violence to humiliate and displace populations. Young girls and elderly women are not spared. These attacks produce long-term physical and psychological damage and a multi-generational crisis of stigma and trauma. Sexual violence is not collateral, it is strategic. It is used to terrorize, to clear populations from contested territories, and in many cases to destroy the social fabric that would allow communities to regroup and resist. The world's failure to treat this as a security emergency is a moral failure of the highest order. Neglected crisis, humanitarian response, and the failure of priorities. Congo's catastrophe has long been described by aid organizations as neglected or forgotten. That label is accurate and damning. Humanitarian funding shortfalls are chronic. With dozens of competing international crises, donor fatigue has set in. Funding that arrives is often late, inadequate, and hampered by insecurity on the ground. NGOs frequently cannot access the worst affected areas because armed groups control routes and threaten aid workers. Peacekeeping has been underpowered and politicized. MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC, has faced repeated criticisms for its inability to prevent mass atrocities despite a large deployment of troops and resources, constraints that include unclear mandates, rules of engagement, and political interference. Local health systems are collapsing under the weight of displacement, outbreaks of disease, and malnutrition. Many deaths attributed to the conflict are indirect, preventable diseases, lack of vaccinations, maternal mortality, yet these deaths are the predictable, avoidable consequences of insecurity and neglect. The International Rescue Committee's stark estimates of millions of dead between 1998 and 2007 are mostly driven by these indirect causes. In short, the world's response has been paralyzed by complexity and geopolitics, while Congo pays the human price. Recent escalations, 2024 to 2025, new waves of violence. The conflict is not frozen in history, it is live and lethal. In 2024 and into 2025, the M23 insurgency and other armed groups renewed offensives in North Kivu and surrounding provinces, producing fresh massacres, the fall of key towns, and the displacement of hundreds of thousands. Reports to the UN indicated that during certain operations, thousands were killed in short time frames, and many more were forced to flee their homes. The Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, an Islamist-linked militia, continued to carry out brutal attacks, including massacres at churches and villages, with significant civilian casualties recorded in late 2024 and 2025. UN missions and human rights groups warned repeatedly about these atrocities, urging international action. Every spike of violence produces the same refrain: shock, a handful of condemnations, perhaps a temporary humanitarian pledge, and then silence. The interruption is not justice, it is mere attention without consequence. Accountability, broken, delayed, partial. Accountability remains the single most important lever to deter future atrocities. Yet accountability for the DRC's massacres is glaringly insufficient. International tribunals and national courts have prosecuted some war criminals, but the scale of the DRC crisis dwarfs the capacity of both national and international justice mechanisms. Many perpetrators remain uninvestigated, and structural impunity persists. The International Criminal Court, ICC, has been involved in certain Congolese cases, yet the logistics of investigating in remote conflict zones, political pushback, and the complexity of proving command responsibility have left countless crimes unprosecuted. The result is a grinding mismatch: crimes on an industrial scale but accountability on a trickle. Worse, allegations of foreign state involvement, for example cross-border support for rebels, complicate the political will to pursue perpetrators. When neighboring capitals have strategic interests tied to armed groups in eastern Congo, the geopolitical calculus frequently drowns out justice. Justice has moral, legal, and practical consequences. Without it, grievances calcify, revenge cycles continue, and entire generations internalize trauma and hatred. The international community's moral debt. If you measure global responses in dollars spent, troops deployed, sanctions issued, and judicial efforts launched, the DRC receives a fraction of what its human catastrophe would justify. Why? Several explanations, none morally acceptable. Geostrategic myopia. Donors and great powers prioritize crises that either threaten their direct interests or occupy the 24-hour news cycle. Long-running humanitarian disasters without clear military or economic leverage get less attention. Complexity and fatigue. The DRC's conflict involves dozens of militant groups, foreign interests, vast geography, and a mix of political, ethnic, and economic drivers. Complexity breeds paralysis. Donors claim, "We don't know how to help." The victims know, the help is simple: protect civilians, fund healthcare, disarm militias, and sanction enablers. Economic complicity. Global demand for minerals and lax supply chain enforcement allow profiteering from conflict resources. Companies and consumers carry moral responsibility for lax practices that benefit armed actors. Regional politics. When neighboring states are implicated or accused of backing proxies, those governments use their leverage to block decisive international action. The result: negotiations between capitals, not justice for survivors. These are not technical excuses. They are moral choices. What must be done? A clear, urgent roadmap. Words have failed. Action must follow. The following is a hard, practical list of what the international community must do, now. 1. Prioritize civilian protection with a firmer UN mandate. MONUSCO and any supporting regional force must have an unequivocal mandate to protect civilians, with robust rules of engagement and the political backing to use force defensively where necessary. The world must stop sending under-mandated missions that cannot act when massacres occur. 2. Establish a large, independent international investigative commission, a body with subpoena powers, protected access to archives, and cooperation agreements with regional governments would gather evidence for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and sexual violence crimes, preserving testimony and building cases for future prosecutions. Support from the UN, EU, and AU is essential. 3. Targeted sanctions and asset freeze. Sanctions must no longer be generic. Freeze the assets of militia leaders, their commercial networks, and corrupt officials who profit from illegal mining. Sanctions must include travel bans on those who facilitate the violence. 4. Enforce conflict-free mineral supply chains. Corporations and states must ensure traceability and block imports of minerals tied to armed groups. Buyers must demand certification or face penalties. The market must be cut off from war profits. 5. Massive-scale humanitarian funding. Donors must fund health, nutrition, shelter, and protection programs at scale. The predictable ripple effects of underfunding are millions more preventable deaths. 6. Survivor-centered justice and reparations. Legal justice must be paired with reparative measures, trauma care, community rebuilding, and economic programs for survivors, especially for women and children who suffer sexual violence. 7. Regional diplomacy demanding withdrawal and non-interference. The African Union, the EU, the UN, and influential states must pressure neighboring capitals to stop supporting proxies. Diplomatic carrots and sticks are both necessary. 8. Media and civil society pressure. International media must treat the DRC as a top priority, not a footnote. NGOs and human rights groups must coordinate to keep the crisis visible. These steps are not utopian. They are the minimum required to prevent further genocide-level carnage. To the readers, do not let this be another forgotten crime. It is convenient for the global conversation to cycle through crises, one week a headline, the next week oblivion. Where Syria, Afghanistan, and Gaza drew intense focus, Congo, too early drew attention only to fade when politicians and donors found other priorities. That neglect has real victims, and it must end. Ask your representatives, what are you doing to end the mass killings in eastern Congo? Ask corporations, can you guarantee none of your products are powered by conflict minerals? Ask international institutions, why are the courts not moving faster?
Demand an emergency plan.
The people of Congo are not statistics. They are fathers, mothers, children, farmers, teachers, and medics. They deserve more than pity or a press release. They deserve a world that treats them as equal in dignity, and equal in the urgency of rescue. Afterward, memory, resistance, and the possibility of justice. History teaches that impunity breeds repetition. Where the world tolerated Balkan carnage once, tens of thousands died before tribunals were convened. In Rwanda, the word "never again" was written across monuments after a genocide that shocked the conscience. Yet in Congo the warning "never again" has not been honored. But justice is possible. The moral arc bends when people insist it will. Survivors and activists in the DRC have not given up. Local human rights defenders keep documenting. Doctors still tend to the worst wounds. Communities rebuild. Those efforts need global backing. If the world wants to say, truly say, they are human, it must act. Not gently, not gradually, but decisively.
If not now, when? If not Congo, who?